The office buzzed around me, voices rising and falling, mingling with the steady clatter of keyboards and murmurs of conversations. It was the usual hum of a workday, familiar, almost comforting. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I glanced down, expecting to see a text from my sister or a quick update from a friend. Instead, the screen lit up with David's name. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped out into the hallway, away from the noise, expecting the usual small talk. How's the day going? How's the project? Maybe he'd mention something trivial about his day. A question about dinner or something equally mundane. But as soon as I answered the call, his voice hit me with an unfamiliar coldness. "I'm divorcing you," he said, his tone flat, almost detached, like he was reading a script. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just the finality of a decision made long ago. I froze, the words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. His voice didn't waver, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd heard him right. My mouth went dry, and I tried to keep my composure. But my mind was racing. Divorce? This wasn't how I'd imagined it. Not in a million years. "You're what?" I asked, my voice sounding more like a question than a statement. "I've already sold the apartment," he continued, a hint of smugness creeping into his words. Like he was somehow proud of the move. "So you'll need to figure out where you're going to stay. Enjoy that." I blinked, my hand tightening around the phone. The shock was immediate, overwhelming. The audacity of it all, it was almost laughable. But there was nothing funny about it. Nothing at all. I swallowed, trying to steady myself, but the world felt like it was tilting beneath me. Was this a bad joke? A prank? Surely not. "You sold the apartment?" My voice barely rose above a whisper, the words tasting bitter as they left my lips. The apartment, the home we'd bought together, the place where we'd shared so many moments. How could he just get rid of it like that? "Yeah," he said, a dry laugh escaping him. "Nicole and I need the money to set up our life together." Nicole. The name landed like a punch to my gut. I'd known something was off for months, the late nights, the unexplained trips, the distance growing between us, but hearing him say her name like that, as though she was the priority now, twisted something inside me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Nicole, the woman he'd been seeing behind my back, the one who had quietly inserted herself into our lives, into our home, without me ever noticing. Or maybe I had noticed, but I'd been too blinded by trust to admit it. "She deserves better than a tiny place like that anyway," David added, as if it was some kind of justification. The betrayal stung, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me falter. I forced my voice to stay level, masking the fury building inside me. "Sounds good," I replied evenly, keeping the edge of my anger buried deep inside. There was no way I was giving him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply his words had cut. "You've made your decision," and just like that, it was done. A relationship that had once felt solid, built on years of love and shared goals, was now a shattered memory. 6 years together, and it had all come down to this phone call. Looking back, there had been signs, small cracks in the foundation that I'd ignored for too long. His dismissiveness, his quick smiles when I asked about finances, the way he brushed off my concerns like they were nothing. He'd always been so confident, so sure of himself, and I'd always assumed that confidence came from knowing what he was doing. Now, I realized it came from knowing how to manipulate me. And somewhere along the way, I'd allowed it. As the call ended, I stood there, my hand still gripping the phone, my mind reeling. The room around me felt distant, like I was suddenly not part of it anymore. The conference room, the buzz of conversation, all of it was just noise in the background. Everything felt wrong. For a few seconds, I thought I might collapse. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. I still had to get through the day. There were meetings to attend, clients to smile at, and presentations to nod through. I had to act like nothing had changed, even when everything inside me was screaming. I walked back into the conference room, sat down at the table, and smiled. I forced the smile, but I kept it there. The rest of the day passed in a blur. David thought he'd won. He thought he could take everything from me, sell the apartment, walk away with his new life, and leave me in the dust. But he was wrong. What he didn't know was that I had been playing the game too. And now, I had the upper hand. The weight of David's words settled in my chest. Heavy and suffocating. I couldn't shake them off. Couldn't stop replaying the call in my mind. I'm divorcing you. I've already sold the apartment. You'll need to figure out where you're going to stay. His voice rang in my ears, almost mocking in its indifference. How could he sound so sure of himself? How could he so easily discard the years we had spent building a life together? I sank into the nearest chair, staring at nothing in particular as the realization began to settle in like a cold fog. 6 years. 6 years of promises, shared dreams, and countless memories, and in a single moment, it all came crashing down. I thought about the apartment, the home we had worked so hard for. That tiny 2-bedroom unit had been more than just bricks and mortar, it had been our sanctuary. It was where we had celebrated victories and weathered storms. It was supposed to be the place we grew old in, where we built our future. Now, that future was a broken promise. My fingers gripped the edge of the table as I tried to steady myself. I knew there had been signs. The late nights, the sudden trips for work, the increasing distance between us. It had all been there. A slow and steady unraveling. But I had ignored it. I had convinced myself it was just a phase. That things would get better. That we'd find our way back to each other. The truth was hard to swallow. He wasn't just distant. He was gone, emotionally, mentally, and now physically. Nicole. The name burned in my mind. The woman he had chosen. The one who had come between us. I could feel the bitterness rising in my throat as I thought about her. About the life he was building with her. She deserves better than a tiny place like that anyway. The words echoed in my mind, cutting deeper than anything he had said before. It wasn't just about the apartment. It was about everything, the way he had completely dismissed me. As if I had never been a part of his world. I'd spent years supporting him, believing in our relationship. And now, here I was, left to pick up the pieces of a life I hadn't even realized was slipping away. I took a deep breath, forcing the tears back. This wasn't the time for weakness. I wasn't going to let him see me break. Not now. Not after everything he'd done. His arrogance. His indifference. No. I wasn't going to let it control me any longer. I stood up, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. I knew exactly who I needed to call. Chloe, my lawyer and my oldest friend, was the only one who could help me navigate this mess. I hit dial, my heart racing as the phone rang in my ear. Chloe's voice came through on the other end, steady and familiar. Hey, Maya, what's going on? I need you, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling in my mind. David's filed for divorce, and he sold the apartment. I need to know what my options are. There was a pause on the other end, and then Chloe's voice softened. Maya, you're not alone in this. Let's get to work. You're going to get through this. Her words were a lifeline. A reminder that I wasn't powerless. That I had a support system I could rely on. The legal battle ahead of me would be tough. But I wasn't about to back down. Not this time. Not when there was still so much at stake. Before I share what happened next, the moment that changed everything and set the wheels of justice in motion, I want to connect with you. My amazing viewers, where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. I wasn't going to let David get away with this. Not now. Not ever. He thought he could walk away from everything we had built. But I was going to show him that I wasn't as naive as he thought. He hadn't just underestimated me. He had underestimated the woman I had become. The rest of the day passed in a blur. My mind racing as I sat through meetings, nodding along to conversations I could barely hear. The words, divorce, and sold, echoed in my head, swirling around like a storm I couldn't escape. Every smile I forced, every handshake I gave felt like a mask. A thin veil covering the overwhelming realization that my life had just been flipped upside down. I wasn't just losing David, I was losing the life I had thought I was building with him. As soon as I got back to my hotel room, I couldn't put it off any longer. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. Grabbing my phone, I called Chloe again. The phone rang once, twice, Before she picked up, her voice calm and steady. As always. Maya, she said, her tone soft but firm. What's going on? I'm going to need you to help me fix this. I said, my voice barely holding together. David's gone too far this time. He sold the apartment, without even telling me. I need to know what I can do. Chloe was quiet for a moment. And when she spoke, her words were laced with determination. Maya, I'm going to help you take this back. I don't care what kind of games David thinks he's playing. We've got the law on our side. A small wave of relief washed over me. But I couldn't let myself relax just yet. What do we do first? We start by notifying the buyer. She said, the sale was illegal from the start. And we need to make sure they know that. Then, I'll draft a letter for David, explaining the consequences of his actions. Fraud isn't something he can just walk away from. The word fraud hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It was about holding David accountable for his actions. Making him understand that his betrayal wasn't going to go unpunished. He thought he could manipulate me. Thought I'd just sit back and let him walk away with everything he wanted. But he had seriously underestimated me. How soon can we send it? I asked, my voice gaining strength with each word. Chloe's reply was immediate. By tomorrow morning, I'll have everything ready. Don't worry, Maya. He won't know what hit him. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. For the first time that day, I wasn't spiraling in fear or anger. I was focused. I knew what needed to be done. And I was ready to do it. David might have thought he'd already won. That he could sell everything we'd worked for and walk away unscathed. But what he didn't know was that I had been playing this game too. Just not in the way he thought. I spent the next few hours organizing my thoughts. Preparing myself for what was coming. I'd have to face David sooner or later. And when I did, I wanted to be ready. I was done being the passive participant in my own life. This was no longer about a marriage. This was about reclaiming control of my home, my future, and my dignity. The moment I stepped into the apartment, the weight of what was about to happen settled heavily on my shoulders. The space that had once felt like a shared home now felt foreign. Like a stage set for a confrontation I couldn't avoid. I'd spent months, no, years, letting David take control of our life together. Giving him the benefit of the doubt. Thinking he'd change. But this was the moment that would shift everything. The moment I would no longer stand by and let him dictate my fate. I didn't have to wait long. The sound of the door slamming open echoed through the apartment. And there he was, David, his face red with anger. His phone gripped tightly in his hand. He stormed in, his eyes wild with frustration. What the hell is this? He shouted. His voice rising with each word as he waved the letter Chloe had sent him in the air. You're telling me I can't sell the apartment? It's half mine. I stood still, my arms crossed, my stance calm and unwavering. The anger in his voice didn't shake me. If anything, it only fueled the calm that was taking over me. This was it. This was the moment I had been preparing for. I wasn't going to flinch. I wasn't going to back down. No, David, I said evenly, my voice almost cold. It's not. The deed has been in my name for months. His eyes flickered with disbelief, then narrowed as he took a step toward me. His face twisting with frustration. What are you talking about? He demanded. His tone dripping with accusation. I reached for the file I had prepared earlier. Pulling out the deed, the tangible proof of my ownership. I held it up in front of him. The paper between us a silent but powerful symbol of my resolve. After we refinanced, I had the deed transferred into my name. I explained calmly, as though we were discussing something as simple as the weather. You signed off on it, remember? Or did you just skim through the paperwork like you always do? His face twisted in anger. The color draining from his cheeks as the weight of what I had just said began to sink in. For a moment, he was silent, his jaw clenched, his hands shaking with barely contained rage. You think you're so smart, don't you? He sneered, stepping back, but I could see the crack in his confidence. The arrogance that had once been so steady was now faltering, slipping away with every word. I didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. I simply let the silence hang in the air for a beat. Watching him struggle to come to terms with the reality I had just handed him. It wasn't just the apartment I had taken back, it was the control he had tried to steal from me. It was my dignity, my power, my ability to make my own decisions. The sale is already void. David, I said quietly, my voice unwavering. The buyer knows it, and they're prepared to take legal action if you don't return the money. This is over. For the first time. He hesitated. The smugness, the self-assuredness, all of it was gone. In its place, I saw something I hadn't expected, fear. Real, raw fear, and I reveled in it. Just for a moment, he opened his mouth to argue. But I didn't let him. I took a step closer. My eyes never leaving his. Oh, and speaking of money? I said, lowering my voice just enough to let it sink in. If you've spent a single cent of that deposit, you're in even bigger trouble. His eyes widened, and for a split second, I could see the panic creeping in. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected me to fight back. To be the one in control. I watched him scramble for a response. His eyes darting around as if searching for a way to weasel out of this mess. But there was nothing left for him to hold onto. He had lost. You don't know what you're talking about. He muttered, looking everywhere but at me. His voice laced with uncertainty. Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about. I said, my voice steady and firm. For years, you've treated me like I'm too naive to see what you were doing. But guess what, David? I've been paying attention, and now you're going to deal with the consequences. He began to pace, his hands running through his hair in frustration. His mind clearly racing to find a way out of this. But there was no escape. The walls were closing in on him. And he knew it. This is ridiculous. He muttered under his breath. You can't just kick me out of here. I raised an eyebrow, not missing a beat. Actually, I can, I said, my tone as sharp as the words themselves. This apartment is legally mine. You can stay for now. But only because I'm giving you the courtesy of time to figure out your next move. But let me be clear. I'm not going anywhere. For a long moment, he stood there, staring at me as if trying to process what had just happened. His frustration gave way to desperation. And I could see the fight draining out of him. He wasn't in control anymore. I was. Over the next few days, things didn't improve. David's anger turned into desperation. He called me repeatedly, leaving frantic voicemails that bounced between begging and threatening. But I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I was no longer the woman he could manipulate. I was the one holding the cards now. Chloe worked behind the scenes, making sure everything was falling into place. The buyer rescinded the agreement, furious at the deception they'd been a part of, and legal proceedings for the divorce began. With each step, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I wasn't just reclaiming the apartment. I was reclaiming my life. David might have thought he had won, that he could take everything from me and walk away unscathed. But he had seriously underestimated me. And now, I was going to make sure he paid for it. As the days passed, David's attempts to manipulate me only grew more desperate. His calls became a constant barrage, each one more frantic than the last. The messages he left ranged from empty apologies to threats. But I didn't flinch. Not anymore. His words no longer held power over me. In fact, each message, each voicemail, only made me more resolute in my decision. This was my fight now. And I was winning. There was something liberating about finally seeing him for what he truly was. A man who had always believed he could have it all, without ever having to face the consequences. But that was no longer the case. I wasn't the woman he had left behind. I wasn't the woman who had once believed in his every word, trusted in his promises. No, I had found something inside myself that he would never recognize. The mornings were the hardest. I woke up to an apartment that still felt foreign. Too quiet, too still, like the air had changed since the last time I had truly breathed freely. But with each passing day, the discomfort faded, replaced by a quiet strength I hadn't known I had. I didn't need David anymore. I didn't need his approval, his presence. I had everything I needed right here, inside me. Inside this space that I was reclaiming piece by piece. I took the time to focus on the little things, the things that made me feel in control again. I rearranged the furniture, moving it the way I had always wanted to. I found the courage to throw out the things he had left behind. The reminders of a life that no longer served me. The photo frames that once held our pictures. The half-empty bottles of his cologne. All of it went, leaving only what was mine. My space. My rules. In the evenings, when the apartment was quiet again, I would take a moment to sit by the window, watching the city lights flicker below. The stillness was no longer a reminder of what I had lost. It was a reflection of what I had gained. Peace. Control. The future was mine to shape now. I'd always assumed that breaking free from David would be the hardest thing I'd ever done. But now that I was here, in this space I had carved out for myself, I saw how wrong I had been. The hardest part wasn't leaving him. It was allowing myself to see that I had been living in a lie. Allowing myself to finally admit how much I had been willing to ignore for the sake of preserving a facade. But that was over now. There would be no more excuses. No more pretending that things could be fixed when I knew they were broken beyond repair. The phone calls started to slow down. His voice on the other end of the line sounded increasingly empty. As if he realized, finally, that there was nothing left to fight for. I never answered. I didn't need to hear him beg. I had already made my decision. Chloe checked in frequently, keeping me updated on the legal side of things. With each passing day, the paperwork for the divorce was moving forward. And David's hold on my life was slipping further away. The fraud charges were officially off the table. But the process itself was a constant reminder of how far I had come. I wasn't just fighting for an apartment anymore. I was fighting for myself. One night, as I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, the sound of the city outside felt different. It wasn't just noise, it was a promise. A promise that my life was mine to control. That I could choose my own happiness. My own future. And that I didn't need anyone's permission to do so. David had underestimated me. He thought I was weak. He thought I was too emotional. Too wrapped up in him to make a move. But he had no idea how strong I had become. I wasn't the same person I had been when I married him. I was someone new. Someone stronger. Someone who knew what it was like to stand tall on her own 2 feet. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. The air was different, lighter, and for the first time, I understood what it meant to be free. There was something profoundly therapeutic about reclaiming the space that had once been shared with David. The apartment, once a symbol of everything we had built together, now felt like a battleground, one I had won. I moved slowly at first. Hesitant, as if testing the waters to see if I could really turn this place back into something that was fully mine. The first change was small, just a rearrangement of the furniture. I shifted the couch, just enough to breathe new life into the room. With every movement, I could feel the old energy of the place shift. It was as if the apartment was waking up, shedding the heavy presence of David's things. His choices, his influence. Each adjustment I made to the room felt like a victory. A reaffirmation that I could take control of my environment. My life. As I sorted through his things, his jackets left draped carelessly over the chair. The shoes still scattered by the door, I felt a mix of emotions. Anger, relief, sadness, too, but more as a memory than a current feeling. I gathered it all together, stacking his belongings in the corner of the living room. It was like clearing away the debris from a storm, slowly but surely removing the remnants of a life that no longer fit me. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about the future. Not just the immediate next steps, but the years ahead. I rearranged the bookshelves, putting my favorite books front and center, just the way I liked them. I placed photographs on the walls, images of friends, of family. Moments of my life that were entirely separate from the man I had been tied to for so long. Each photo was a reminder of who I was before him. And more importantly, who I had become since we had parted ways. I spent hours putting things together, moving things around until the apartment started to feel like a reflection of me. My favorite art piece, a painting I had picked out on a solo trip years ago, found its place above the fireplace. It was vibrant, full of color, nothing like the muted tones that had once dominated the space. The walls, once a backdrop to David's life, were now a canvas for my own. The more I settled in, the more I could feel the weight lifting. The apartment no longer felt like a prison, it felt like home again. It was mine, completely mine, and in that realization, something shifted inside me. I wasn't just taking back the apartment. I was taking back myself. I was reclaiming my sense of self. My independence. My peace. I sat down on the couch. Finally, taking it all in. The space was different now. Transformed by my own hands. It was quiet, yes. But in that quiet, there was no longer the shadow of David's presence hanging over me. There was no tension in the air. No remnants of a past life I had been too afraid to let go of. This was my place. My life. I realized, in that moment, how much I had underestimated the power of creating space for myself. Not just in the apartment, but in my heart, in my mind. For so long, I had allowed someone else's needs, someone else's desires, to define me, but now, I had stepped into a new chapter. I was living for myself. And that was enough. I looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker beneath the night sky. And for the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. The future no longer seemed like an uncertain blur. It was wide open, full of possibilities, and I was finally free to step into it on my own terms. David had thought he could take everything from me. He thought he could leave me scrambling, lost, unsure of where to go next. But what he didn't realize was that by trying to break me, he had only made me stronger. This space, this apartment, was no longer a reminder of betrayal or loss. It was a testament to my resilience. It was mine, just as I was now. And no one could take that from me again. The final confrontation was inevitable. I had known it was coming. But nothing could have prepared me for the emotional gravity of that moment. As I sat in the living room, the apartment now fully mine, the doorbell rang, and I felt a chill run through me. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. But now that it was here, it felt so real, so heavy. It wasn't just about David anymore. It was about closing this chapter once and for all. I stood up slowly, my hands steady as I opened the door. There he was, standing on the other side. His face a mix of anger, frustration, and something I couldn't quite place, maybe guilt, maybe disbelief. He was no longer the confident, untouchable man I had once known. The storm of emotions that had built up inside me over the past weeks had finally found their release. And I wasn't backing down. You think you can just take everything from me, don't you? His voice cracked as he stepped inside. And I couldn't help but notice the way his hands trembled, betraying the bravado he tried so hard to maintain. I didn't speak at first. I let him vent, let him say everything he needed to say, as if it could somehow change anything. But I wasn't listening to his words anymore. I was done with that. Instead, I watched him, studying the way his anger seemed to fizzle out the moment he realized I wasn't intimidated. I wasn't the woman who would beg him to stay or plead for his affection. That woman was gone. You've made your choice, David, I said, my voice calm and controlled. There was no anger, no frustration in my tone, just finality. And I've made mine. His eyes narrowed. This is ridiculous, he spat, taking a step closer, his anger rising. You can't just kick me out of our home. This place is as much mine as it is yours. I stood my ground, unmoved by his words. No, it's not, I said, my voice growing firmer with each word. It's mine. The deed has been in my name for months. And you know it. I don't owe you anything. David, not anymore. His expression faltered for a brief moment. But then he recovered, sneering at me as if this was all some game he was still playing. You think you've won? He asked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. You've ruined everything. The sale was done. I was going to have a life. And now you're going to make sure I lose it all. His words were venomous, but they didn't sting. They barely reached me anymore. I had already come to terms with everything he had taken from me. What mattered now was what I was taking back. You're not ruining anything, I replied calmly, refusing to let him see how deeply his betrayal still hurt. You're just finally facing the consequences of your actions. David opened his mouth to argue again. But I cut him off, my patience wearing thin. I'm not interested in your excuses. David, the apartment sale was illegal. And the buyer knows it. You tried to sell something you didn't own. And now you're going to deal with the fallout. You think this is over? It's only just begun. He stood there, frozen for a moment, as if he couldn't quite process the reality of what I was saying. I watched him, every inch of me firm, resolute. His desperation was almost palpable. But it was no longer my problem. I told you before, I continued, my voice unwavering. I'm not going anywhere. This apartment is mine. And you need to leave. He stepped back, the frustration radiating off him in waves. But I stood tall, not flinching. I'm giving you time to figure out your next move. But make no mistake, David, this is my space, my life. And you are no longer welcome here. For a moment, he said nothing. He just stared at me, his gaze hardening with every passing second. Then, in a voice laced with barely contained rage, he said, "You think you've won? You'll see. Everything's going to fall apart. You're making a huge mistake." I didn't react to his threats. Instead, I simply nodded, my expression calm and almost pitying. Maybe, but at least I'll be the one to decide how things end. Not you. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of all that had been said and unsaid. David stood there, defeated, as if every ounce of power he once held over me had evaporated in that moment. The anger still burned in his eyes. But it was no longer directed at me. He knew he had lost. He knew he had overplayed his hand. "I don't want to do this," I said quietly, my voice softening for just a moment. But the words still carried their weight. "But I won't let you take everything from me. Not anymore." He didn't respond, just stood there, the realization settling in, slowly, with a defeated sigh. He turned and walked toward the door. I didn't watch him go. Instead, I turned away, knowing that this was the end of something I'd been fighting for far too long. As the door clicked shut behind him, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was finally over. The battle, the struggle, the endless years of doubt and fear, it was all behind me now. The silence that filled the apartment felt different this time. It wasn't empty. It wasn't cold. It was peaceful. I was free. The days that followed felt like a rebirth. I had lived in the shadow of my past for so long that I hadn't realized how heavy it had weighed on me. But now, with each sunrise, I felt the burden lifting. Piece by piece, the apartment, once a symbol of all that had gone wrong, was finally starting to feel like home again. Not just a place I resided in, but a place I could truly live in, breathe in, and claim as mine. I spent the next few weeks settling into this new chapter. Each day a new opportunity to create something for myself. The space, now completely rearranged, reflected the changes inside me. I began to fill the rooms with the things that made me feel grounded, photos of friends, books I had put off reading, and small trinkets from my travels. It was more than just redecorating, it was a reclamation of the parts of myself I had lost along the way. The things I once sacrificed for the sake of a relationship. The parts of me I'd buried under the weight of someone else's expectations. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in a long while. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same person who had entered that marriage. Not the person who had been blindsided by betrayal and lies. She was stronger, more self-assured, and there was a fire in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had fought and won, and now, she was ready for the life she had been waiting for. I wasn't alone in this. I had friends, a support system that had rallied around me when I needed it the most. Lauren, especially, had been there through every phone call, every tear, every victory. She came over one afternoon to help me go through the last of David's things. And as we sat on the couch, sorting through the chaos of the past, she looked at me and smiled. "You're glowing," she said, raising a glass of wine in her hand. "Single life suits you." I laughed, the sound feeling foreign at first, but quickly becoming something that felt right. "It's not the single life," I replied, lifting my own glass. "It's the freedom." For the first time in years, I wasn't living under anyone else's rules. I wasn't trying to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. I was learning to live for myself. And that was more liberating than anything I could have imagined. I had rediscovered a part of me that I had forgotten. A part of me that had always been there, waiting to rise from the ashes of my past. As the weeks turned into months, the apartment transformed into more than just a physical space. It became a sanctuary, a reflection of my growth, my strength, and my resilience. It was no longer just a place I had shared with someone who had betrayed me. It was a place where I had taken back control. A place where I could finally breathe without fear of what was to come next. David had thought he could leave me broken, lost, and scrambling. He had thought that by taking everything from me, he would win, but he had underestimated me. What he didn't realize was that by trying to tear me down, he had only built me up stronger. I was no longer the woman I had been when I married him. I was someone new, someone who had learned to fight for herself, who had learned to trust her own instincts, and who had learned that her happiness was in her own hands. The day I signed the final divorce papers, there was no sense of sadness or regret. There was no lingering attachment to the life we had shared. I signed them with a sense of finality, but also with a sense of peace. The chapter was closed, the story was over, and I had written my own ending. The future, once so uncertain, now seemed wide open. I had plans, big ones, small ones, but all of them were mine to make. I didn't need anyone's approval, and I certainly didn't need anyone to complete me. I had learned to stand on my own, to build my own future, and that was enough. As I looked out the window that night, the city lights twinkling below, I knew that this was just the beginning. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I was finally free, and nothing, not even the weight of the past, could take that away from me.